Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Do oximeters have a bias against dark skins? What the British newspaper The Sunday Times calls a racist bias. And if the answer is yes, what does that mean for you and me who are of brown color? That's the key issue I should explore today with the Director of Britain's National Health Service's Race and Health Observatory, Dr. Habib Naqvi. Dr. Naqvi, a paper put out by your organization says, and I'm quoting, the accuracy of pulse oximeter readings from Black and minority ethnic people could be seriously misleading, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Can I start by asking, what precisely do you mean by seriously misleading? Could you explain that, please?
Well, some of the founding principles of every healthcare system across the globe is equity and fairness. And the possibility that a bias, even if it's unconscious, could lead to poorer health outcomes for some of our communities is totally unacceptable. Now, when we look at pulse oximeters, which are devices clipped to a person's finger to check the level of oxygen in the blood, we know through research that the darker your skin, i.e. the more pigmentation in a person's skin, the darker the tone of the skin, the more inaccurate the readings are from these medical devices. And that's absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical during COVID-19, which is, of course, as we know now, a disease that affects predominantly the lungs and impacts upon the level of oxygen in the body.
You said that the darker the pigmentation, the more inaccurate is the oximeter reading. Does that mean that for people like me of my color, which is what Indians are, it's anyway inaccurate because we're darker than white people, but it becomes even more inaccurate for Black people? Would I be right in saying that?
Yes, you would. And the research suggests that pulse oximeters can overstate the level of oxygen in the blood from people from different ethnicities. And as you say, the more pigment in your skin, the darker the skin, the more inaccurate the chances are, the more inaccurate these devices are.
Before I go further, I think I should ask you, out of fairness, how confident are you of this finding, that the darker the pigmentation of the person, the more inaccurate the oximeter reading? How confident are you of this?
Well, we published a rapid review in March of this year, which looked at research going back to 1990 and looking at of course, these medical devices, pulse oximeters, and the accuracy of these, but looking at other research as well. The review outlined a series of recommendations for healthcare systems, regulatory bodies, and research bodies to address, the misleading readings and potentially, looking at regulating medical devices so that they are applicable to all backgrounds, people from all backgrounds, all ethnicities, going forward.
So if I understand your answer correctly, you've had suspicions about oximeters going back into the early 90s, and your research now has confirmed that suspicion, and you now believe it's become a fact.
The fact is that health inequalities associated with ethnicity have been in our society, particularly in the UK, for decades. What COVID-19 has done over the last 18 to 20 months is to resurface those inequalities and bring to the surface and at the top of our mind some of the inequalities that have persisted for decades, but have now become really apparent for us to focus on and to tackle head on.
To go back to oximeters and COVID, if the reading on dark skins of an oximeter is inaccurate, doesn't it then mean that for tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of Asian and Black people who, when the COVID pandemic was raging in their respective countries, got comfort from the fact that the oximeter was suggesting their oxygen levels were safe, were in fact being misled? It might actually have been a lot lower than what the meter was suggesting?
That's a huge possibility. And what the research indicates, particularly in the UK, is that Black people were twice as likely as white people to catch COVID-19. People from Asian heritage in the UK were 1.5 times more likely than white counterparts to be infected by COVID-19. That's why it's absolutely crucial that those who use pulse oximeters in their practice or provide them to the public, i.e., people using these devices at home, take skin pigmentation into account when considering the effectiveness amongst those that use these devices.
You just gave me a series of British statistics. I noticed from my research that during the first year of the pandemic, up to March 2021, British national statistics suggest that the death rate for Black and Asian people was higher than the death rate for white people, and that is after taking into account such things as underlying health conditions, poverty, and occupation. So does it mean that this differential in death rate is partly or mainly or primarily because of the oximeter being faulty?
Well, more research needs to be done in this area to ascertain that. But what we do know is that ethnic minority people, particularly in the UK, are more likely to have comorbidities, are more likely to be on the front end of services, whether that's working in the healthcare system or working in the public sector, more likely to live in multi-generational households. But the key fact here that we need to kind of think about within our own society and within other societies across the globe is what is the reason, what's the causes of ethnic minorities being at higher risk? Why are they more likely to be on the front end of public sector jobs? Why are they more likely to have comorbidities? And that's one of the things that the NHS Race and Health Observatory in the UK has been set up to explore some of the causes of the disparities and the stratification that we see in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of experiences of healthcare, and therefore outcomes from the healthcare system.
Let me quote what the science editor of the Sunday Times, Ben Spencer, wrote on Sunday, that's just 3 days ago. It is hard not to come to the conclusion that Black and Asian people were denied life-saving treatment because the device clipped to the end of their finger was designed for someone of a different race. What he's really saying is that because oximeters were originally designed with white people in mind, in other words, the trials when they were being made were done with white people, they are less efficacious with darker skins. And as a result, when oximeter readings were taken of people who were Asian and Black, they gave a false impression that the oxygen levels were good, whereas in fact they may have been pretty bad. And as a result, people who needed treatment didn't get it and perhaps died.
The announcement of the review into this on 3 days ago on Sunday in the newspaper article that you cite is absolutely welcome for that particular reason. We need to get to the bottom of this. We need more research. We need more evidence so that we can come to firm conclusions around the factors that contributed and continue to contribute to the higher rates of infection and death amongst ethnic minority people from COVID. Now, the fact is that pulse oximeters are just one example of a range of medical devices that need to be looked at in terms of racial bias. We know that other medical devices, even some drugs, procedures, risk assessments within healthcare, textbooks that are read within undergrad, postgrad degrees are all put together predominantly in majority white countries. And so there appears to be a level of systematic bias or a systematic issue with regard to the applicability of these devices, these drugs and procedures for diverse populations, not just in the UK, but across the globe.
Absolutely. I'll come to the bigger point you're making in a moment's time, that the problem with oximeters applies to a whole lot of other drugs, which means it applies to treatment. It also, as you say, because the books on which doctors are taught are designed for white audiences, it also applies to the manner in which they're taught. But I'll come to that in a moment's time. Let me just briefly focus on oximeters again. You're absolutely understandably right when you say more research is needed to establish the extent to which malfunctioning oximeters are responsible for people ending up dead. But to an extent, is this not corroborated by findings from the University of Michigan? I gather they're just about a year to 18 months old. The University of Michigan says that it's the American and Black American patients are 3 times more likely to end up with faulty oximeter readings than white patients. And the British paper, the Sunday Times, takes it one step further and says 12% of Black patients in America who were considered to have safe oxygen levels were in fact dangerously hypoxic. In other words, false oximeter readings meant that 12% of Black patients were dangerous, needed oxygen, but didn't get it because the oximeter suggested wrongly they didn't need it.
Our research that we published in March, as I said, goes back 30 years and indicates that more detailed analyses and independent assessments are needed to help determine the future development of devices, including pulse oximeters, ensuring healthcare devices are accurate and effective for all of our communities. Now, there's 2 things here. One is that in the short term, we need to make sure that our healthcare systems that are using pulse oximeters have this kind of warning at the forefront of their mind, so that when pulse oximeters are being used in the here and the now, that the readings are looked at with a level of caution. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is a kind of the medium term, the medium term goal, is exactly what the Health Secretary in the UK announced just a few days ago, which is a fundamental review of not just pulse oximeters, but medical devices in general, so that going forward, we can be assured that medical devices, healthcare assessments, risk assessments, etc., are inclusive and meet the needs of our diverse communities.
Let me ask you for your hunch. Do you think that during the devastating second wave that hit India in April and May this year, when at its peak, the number of people dying just crossed 5,000 a day, faulty oximeters could have had a fairly significant role to play?
That is a possibility. But as I said, we need to look at a fundamental review into this. We are doing that. We will be doing that in the UK. And I hope that other countries across the globe, I know the US are looking into this specifically as well. And I hope other countries across the globe will be able to look at this with a level of urgency. Now, the fact is that these devices, as well as other medical devices, are fundamentally put together, designed within white majority countries in the main. When we start to look at the causes of...
Sorry, carry on.
So when we start to look at the causes of the outcomes and the hunches, as you put it, we need to understand the fact that the clinical trials upon which these devices are designed and put together are clinical trials and research that's not always representative of the diverse communities, i.e., there is a lack of representation from ethnic minority people within clinical trials. And therefore, we need to ensure that we have representation within research, medical research and clinical trials, so that when devices are designed, they're designed for the majority population, i.e. all communities. And that's fundamental here in order for us to kind of focus on the root causes of some of the issues to do with medical devices.
Let me put that into simple English that Indians would understand. You spoke very carefully and understandably, you spoke generically. But what you're saying is that because a very large number of devices are invented in the West, they are tried and tested on people with white skins. We now need to do further testing to ensure that those same devices work equally effectively on people of darker skins. And if they don't, then we need to also work out what level of adjustment needs to be borne in mind when a device designed and tested on a white skinned person is actually being used on a brown or black skinned person. In a nutshell, that's what you're saying the review needs to do.
Absolutely. That's a fundamental issue that we will need to look at as we move forward. And of course, as you say, that's not just an issue for us in the UK, that's an issue for all communities across the globe, because these medical devices are sold and shipped across the globe to different countries.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's important that we fundamentally get this right.
Now, I absolutely understand the need for a review. And as you said, it's important that not just the UK and the US, but other countries do it. So your personal advice to India, because of the size of the country and the sort of waves it's experienced, is India needs also to urgently review the functioning of oximeters so that you can be certain that it is not malfunctioning when used by Indians of brown skin. That review in India, you're saying, is necessary.
Absolutely. I would urge countries across the globe to undertake reviews around potential racial bias, not just in pulse oximeters, but in medical devices as a whole. And also for India and other countries to keep a watchful eye on the progress that we will be making in the NHS Race and Health Observatory and in the UK through this review that's been announced. And other work that we will be carrying out, looking at racial bias within medical devices.
A review, of course, is essential, but equally a review will take time. It's not something that can happen overnight. It could take weeks or months. In the meantime, we're living with a pandemic that is persistent, and we keep seeing in different countries different waves that can often rise fairly high. So in the meantime, before the review happens, is there a way doctors and nurses can take ethnicity, i.e. pigmentation, into account when reading oximeters? Or is that impossible at this moment?
What is possible at this moment is for healthcare systems across the globe to update their guidance on pulse oximeters, so that they are aware of the possibility that that readings from pulse oximeters for people with more pigmentation, darker skin, can be misleading. That guidance needs to be out there with a level of urgency. That's what we've done in the UK. We've updated the guidance on the NHS, which is a healthcare system in the UK, on the NHS website, and that needs to be followed through, I believe, across the globe.
So what you're saying is that doctors and nurses in India should be aware that when oximeter readings are taken of people with brown or black skin, they could be misleading, they could be suggesting a higher level of oxygen than is the truth, and therefore they should find other ways of double and triple checking so that they know for sure the correct treatment is being given. Is that what you're saying?
Care needs to be taken with regards to the looking at the readings of pulse oximeters and interpreting those readings, so that rather than just taking one reading, maybe multiple readings should be taken in order to be certain that there is a level of accuracy from pulse oximeters. That is a kind of a fundamental thing that can be put in place right now.
Okay, that's very important. Don't just take one reading, take multiple readings, double, triple, and quadruple check to make sure that the reading is accurate. Let's come very briefly before I end to the issue you were raising earlier, which I stopped you from elaborating on at that time. The point you're making is that this problem of ethnic or dark skin bias is not limited to oximeters. And as a colleague of yours, Ravi Sharma, a director of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, told the Sunday Times, he says, the way drugs are developed, the vast majority of drug trials are designed with white patients in mind. And this is a problem because drugs often work differently for different ethnicities. So at the very root of drug development, the racial bias unintentionally does creep in. Because drugs are tested on white skins, and that's because most drugs tend to be developed in the West, they are efficacious for white skins, but we haven't tested to know how efficacious they are for brown and black skins. How many critical drugs could be affected by this? I know it affects, for instance, ACE inhibitors, which are essential for blood pressure and don't work well on black people. I know morphine-based painkillers like codeine don't work well, apparently, with Chinese patients. But how many other critical drugs could be affected?
That's something that the review will certainly look at. Now, ACE inhibitors and hypertension is a critical area because we know that the prevalence of high blood pressure or hypertension is higher amongst the Black community, particularly in the UK. And if a drug that has been prescribed to the Black community to help control hypertension has a level of bias within it, i.e. will be less likely to work for Black communities, then that's a huge issue. But there's a fundamental issue here as well, because whilst there may be subtle cultural differences in the way that different ethnic people present their symptoms with regards to their disease, we also know that there is bias. There's bias in, for example, clinicians' assumptions around pain and pain management, and we've got evidence around that. There's bias in policies and procedures that have been around, particularly, as I can say, in the UK and the NHS for decades now. And there's also bias, as we've just highlighted and elaborated upon, in the evidence upon which interventions are designed and services are designed and delivered within a healthcare system. We see time and time again that when research is commissioned, as I highlighted earlier, it often excludes diverse communities, and these communities are underrepresented in medical research, are underrepresented in clinical research, and people leading those research and those clinical trials are also not representative of the diverse communities that we have. So some fundamental questions need to be answered here. And I'm hoping that the review will touch upon those causes of the causes, as well as looking at what we can do in the here and the now.
Let me pick up very quickly on something you said a little earlier in the interview. You said even the manuals on the basis of which doctors are trained are actually written on the basis of white patients who've been treated and the procedure necessary for treating them. And that may not apply to brown and black patients. Now, that means a lot of doctors who are trained are not adequately trained for the way in which brown and black patients differ from white. And that would therefore mean even Indian doctors treating Indian patients would have the same problem because they're all trained on the same manuals. Isn't that true?
That is true. And when we put out our rapid review on racial bias in pulse oximeters in March of this year, following the publication of that report, we had a number of doctors that came and contacted us to say, actually, we were not aware of this. We were not taught this when we were at university. But that's not just limited to pulse oximeters. That's across all kinds of different conditions, whether it's skin conditions, looking at rashes, and different types of skin conditions that we have, or whether it's looking at something else that we're looking into within the NHS Race and Health Observatory, which is the APGAR score, which is basically a score or a procedure that checks whether or not a baby is healthy minutes after its birth. Now, that score has been around in the UK since 1952, so 70 years. And yet, as part of its criteria to check the health of a baby, there is a line that asks the clinician to look at whether or not the baby is pink in color. Now, of course, that does not apply to people with darker skin. And so we are looking at the biases that we have in our medical devices, but also procedures as well.
Absolutely. To put it in a nutshell, in somewhat simple language, to ask whether a black baby is pink is meaningless because the pinkness won't show up against the black pigmentation of the baby. I'm coming to my last question, but we began by worrying about the inaccuracy inherent in oximeters as far as people of darker skins are concerned. And now we find that it's not just an inaccuracy that's inherent in and limited to oximeters. It applies to a whole lot of drugs, which were tested and devised with white patients in mind, and may not apply equally to brown and black. Mm-hmm. It therefore applies to the treatment that doctors give, because they may be recommending medicines without realizing they're not as effective with brown and black skins as they would be with white. And when we talk about manuals, which we did a moment ago, it applies to diagnosis as well. So suddenly, this is a problem that began with oximeters. It actually begins to affect a whole lot of drugs. In turn, that affects treatment. And now we discover that even the initial diagnosis, because of the manuals on which doctors are trained, may not be accurate. It could be faulty. So my last question is this: how serious is this total problem?
It's a critical issue. We know it's a critical issue for us in the UK. And that's why the NHS Race and Health Observatory was established and began its work in April of this year to look at these fundamental causes. Because we know that, and if I can use the example of the UK, we know that ethnic minority people have a level of inequity with regards to access to healthcare systems, with regards to experience of the healthcare system, and therefore with regards to outcomes. There is, against that, is a higher rates of diseases and conditions which are very specific to Black and Asian communities, higher rates of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mental illness, issues around maternity, as I've highlighted. And as we've seen over the last 18 to 20 months, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 upon ethnic minority people is there for us to see.
Absolutely.
So I guess.
So can I interrupt and put it like this? You're understandably talking with the UK in mind. That's where you are. But everything you're saying applies to India as well. Oximeters being inaccurate applies to India. Drugs being ineffective for brown and black skins applies to India. The fact that therefore, if drugs are ineffective, the treatment may be ineffective also applies to India. And if the manuals on which doctors are trained don't necessarily bear the additional concerns of brown and black people in mind, then even the diagnosis that doctors come up with in India could be inaccurate. This problem applies to India exactly in the same way as it does to the UK.
Absolutely. And that's why there's a level of urgency for us to focus on this agenda. And also what applies to Indians are the higher rates of some of the diseases and conditions that I mentioned as well. And so we need to focus on this. And that's what we're doing in the UK. But we hope that other countries around the globe will also be able to focus on some of the biases that are inherent within healthcare systems.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Naqvi. You've opened our eyes to a problem that we didn't know about and which sadly our media in India even when it found out about it, did not give it the importance it deserves. I'm grateful to you. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.